When the first settlers drifted westward, chasing gold, land, or simply the promise of freedom, they did not realize that the greatest enemy they would face was not bandits, hunger, or isolation, but the cold, a deep, biting, merciless cold that wrapped the frontier in silence and shadow. The Wild West, so often imagined in blazing sunsets and dusty trails, was in truth a place where winter could break the strongest spirit. The vast plains and mountain passes turned white and endless under snow that buried cabins and froze rivers solid, where the air itself could seem alive, whispering through the gaps of wooden walls, stealing warmth, testing endurance. In the first years of expansion, survival was a matter not of bravery, but of patience, planning, and a stubborn refusal to die. The settlers who came from the east carried little understanding of what it meant to live in such a climate. They brought their city tools, their thin wool coats, and their belief that nature could be conquered. But the frontier taught them differently. It humbled them. The wind that roared down from the Rockies was older and stronger than any man, and it stripped away arrogance like leaves in a storm. Many who arrived in the autumn never saw another spring. Their wagons became coffins. Their homesteads vanished beneath the snow. For those who endured, life became a ritual of small victories. Before the first frost, they cut wood obsessively, stacking cords upon cords until walls of logs surrounded their cabins. They sealed every crack with mud, straw, and even old cloth to stop the drafts. Windows, if they had them, were covered in oiled paper or animal hides, for glass was rare and precious. Food was salted, smoked, or buried deep in cellars, lined with straw, where the ground's own chill kept it safe. Water came from melted snow, and fires burned constantly, the smoke thick and heavy, leaving everything, clothing, hair, furniture, smelling of ash and pine. Nights were long and silent, except for the groan of wood as the cold tightened its grip. Inside those cramped rooms, families huddled together for warmth, speaking little, listening to the wind howl through the endless dark. The cold had its own rhythm, and those who learned to live with it found strange beauty within its cruelty. The mornings glowed pale blue, the frost painting the world in crystal. The sound of footsteps on frozen snow was sharp, echoing like glass breaking in the stillness. The sky felt closer, the stars brighter, as though the universe itself had drawn nearer to the earth. But beauty could not distract from the danger. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and sometimes whole limbs. Livestock perished overnight, their carcasses stiff before dawn. Travelers caught between settlements froze where they fell. Found weeks later beneath drifts, their faces serene as if asleep. Every trip outside the cabin was a negotiation with death, to fetch water, to check traps, to chop more wood. The settlers learned to read the air, to know when the wind would turn deadly, when snow would come heavy and fast. Some claimed they could hear it before it arrived, a kind of humming deep in the earth, like a warning. Those who lived in isolated cabins found themselves cut off for months, unable to see another soul. Loneliness became another form of frost. Men spoke to themselves, to the fire, to the wind. Women stared at the horizon until they could no longer tell dreams from waking. The silence was so complete, it pressed upon the mind, a weight heavier than snow. In those endless months, time lost meaning. Days blurred together in a cycle of tending fires, rationing food, and waiting for thaw. Letters from the east arrived months late, if at all, and the world beyond the frontier seemed more myth than memory. Yet, even in that harshness, there was resilience. People built from what they had. If a roof caved in, it was patched with hides. If food ran out, they hunted rabbits, trapped foxes, or boiled bones for broth. The strong helped the weak. Neighbors, though miles apart, risked their lives to share supplies. There were stories, half legend, half truth, of settlers walking 50 miles through blizzards to bring medicine or firewood to strangers. The cold tested humanity, but it also bound those who survived into something unbreakable. They emerged from each winter changed, quieter perhaps, harder in spirit, yet strangely at peace with the land that had nearly destroyed them. When spring finally came, it did not arrive gently. The thaw was violent, rivers bursting with melted ice, mud swallowing wheels and hooves alike. But to the survivors, it was a kind of rebirth. They would stand outside their cabins, the first sunlight warm on their faces, the scent of thawed earth rising like incense. And they would remember every storm, every frozen night, every moment when death had seemed near, and they would know they had beaten it. The Wild West would go on to be remembered for its gunslingers, its railroads, its gold. But beneath all that legend was this simple truth. It was built by people who learned to survive the cold. They did not tame it. No one ever truly could, but they endured it long enough to carve life from its silence. When the sun disappeared behind the western ridges and the world sank into the long silence of midwinter, life on the frontier transformed into a battle against the endless night. A slow war fought not with guns or blades, but with patience, firewood, and the human will to stay awake against despair. The nights were monstrous in their length, stretching far beyond the hours the body was made to endure, beginning in the late afternoon and not releasing their grip until late morning, as if time itself had frozen. The settlers came to understand that darkness was not merely an absence of light, but a presence, heavy, suffocating, alive. It crept through the cracks of their cabins, whispered at the edges of their dreams, and reminded them of how small they were against the wilderness. Inside their wooden homes, the only defense was fire, that fragile miracle of warmth that hissed and crackled like a heartbeat. They guarded it obsessively, feeding it even when wood ran low. For a single mistake, a night when the embers died could mean frostbite, illness, or death. The fire became a companion, a silent witness to their endurance. Its glow, the only proof that life still flickered in the frozen dark. Children, unable to sleep, would whisper stories by the hearth, tales of warmth and green valleys far to the east, of angels who watched over travelers lost in blizzards, of brave hunters who fought the winter spirits that prowled unseen. Adults listened without interrupting, letting the stories distract them from the gnawing fear that the wind outside might never stop. That wind had a voice, low, mournful, and unending, a sound that could twist through the mind until it felt like a living thing, watching, waiting. Some settlers said it carried the cries of the lost, travelers who had frozen on the plains, or miners who had vanished in the mountains, their souls condemned to wander until spring. Others swore it was simply the sound of the earth itself breathing. Whatever the truth, the wind was constant, and in the silence between gusts, people could hear their own hearts beating and wonder how long they could last. The nights tested not just the body, but the mind. Isolation and exhaustion could drive even the strongest toward madness. Men began to see faces in the fire, to speak to shadows that answered back. Women counted the days by candle stubs and forgot what month it was. The darkness distorted everything. It stretched minutes into hours, and dreams bled into waking. Many settlers began marking days on cabin walls with charcoal, carving small notches like prisoners keeping track of sentences. They found comfort in routine, tending the fire, checking traps, mending clothes, small acts of order against the chaos outside. Some prayed aloud each evening before the fire, not for wealth or safety, but simply for mourning. Yet, in those long nights, there was also a kind of strange beauty that no one could describe to those who had not lived it. The sky, when it cleared, was a cathedral of stars, vast and cold, with the Milky Way spilling across it like frozen smoke. Sometimes, when the temperature dropped to unbearable lows, the air itself glittered, ice crystals suspended in moonlight, so bright that the land seemed to glow. The aurora would appear ribbons of green and violet undulating silently over the horizon, and for a moment, even the most hardened frontiersman felt something like reverence. It was as if the heavens themselves had opened, and all the cold and pain below were small, temporary things. Those moments, though rare, sustained people through the worst nights. They would speak of them months later, recalling how the light danced and how, for an instant, the wilderness did not feel hostile but holy inside. Warmth was built through layers, quilts made from tattered clothes, animal furs piled on beds, and sometimes even livestock brought indoors to share heat. The smell of smoke, sweat, and animals was thick, but no one complained. It was the scent of survival. Food was rationed carefully. Meals shrank from stews and bread to thin broth. Hunger crept in quietly, dulling minds and slowing movements. And yet people carried on, because stopping meant freezing. They learned to sleep in shifts, one always awake to watch the fire. The silence between breaths became sacred. Even the smallest spark was hope. Those who had lived through many winters became teachers for the rest. They knew how to read the signs of a storm, how to feel the pressure drop, how to bank a fire so it would burn through the night without wasting wood. They passed on knowledge not from books, but from pain. The memory of fingers blackened by frostbite, of neighbors buried when roofs collapsed under snow, of nights when screams were swallowed by the wind. Their lessons were simple but priceless. Never underestimate the cold. Never travel after dark. Never trust a thaw too early. In the Wild West, experience was worth more than gold. Sometimes, the night revealed unexpected kindness. A stranger might knock half frozen and be given shelter without question. People who might have been enemies in summer became allies in winter. There was no room for pride or vengeance when the cold came. It stripped away all pretense, leaving only the raw human need to survive together. Those who helped others were remembered long after they were gone. Their names spoken softly by firesides when storms returned, not as heroes, but as reminders of what it meant to stay human when the world froze by the time spring came. Many who had entered the winter strong emerged gaunt, pale, and silent. They had endured the endless night, but it had changed them. They spoke more slowly, laughed less, and looked at the sky with the wary respect of soldiers who had seen battle. The frontier did not reward the reckless. It only spared those who learned its rules. And the greatest of those rules was simple. The cold was not an enemy to be defeated, but a force to be endured, a teacher, merciless and eternal, whose lessons were written in frost and firelight. By the middle of winter, the Wild West was less a place and more a state of mind, a test that pressed against every weakness and flaw in a human being until either the body broke or the spirit hardened like iron. The cold was no longer just something felt on the skin. It lived inside the bones, deep and persistent, a dull ache that never truly faded. The people who survived it learned that warmth was a kind of illusion, something you earned moment by moment, never given freely. Every breath turned to fog, every step crunched against a world that seemed made entirely of glass. The land stretched out, white and merciless, beneath skies the color of old iron. Sometimes, entire weeks passed without the sun ever breaking through, and the world existed only in shades of gray and blue. The settlers stopped speaking of days and nights. They spoke only of the cold, as if it were a single, unending thing, a presence that swallowed time. Fires became the axis of life, small suns burning in the darkness. Families learned to tend them as though they were sacred altars, kneeling before the flames to feed them, watch them, and whisper to them when the wind howled outside. To lose the fire was to lose everything. Men would stumble into the woods by lantern light to gather branches, their breath freezing in the air, fingers too stiff to bend. They knew the rules by heart: never wander too far, never stop moving, never fall asleep in the snow. Those who ignored these truths were found days later, lying peacefully beneath the drifts, eyes open, faces strangely calm. Inside the cabins, the air was thick with wood smoke and the smell of wet wool. Everything dampened: boots, gloves, coats, never quite drying, never quite freezing. The walls creaked like living things, expanding and contracting with the cold. At night, the wind found every gap, sighing through them like whispers from ghosts. People spoke less. Words froze between them. The sound of chopping wood became the rhythm of existence, a steady heartbeat that echoed through the white silence. Outside, even the animals had vanished into their burrows. Coyotes no longer howled. The world was so quiet that one could hear snow settling on the roof or ice forming on the window pane. It was a strange kind of peace, vast, heavy, and not meant for the living. But amid that stillness, life persisted in small, fierce ways. Mothers mended clothing with frozen fingers, stitching patches by candlelight. Children collected icicles from the eaves, pretending they were swords or wands, their laughter thin but defiant. Old men carved wood, shaping animals and faces from memory, their knives scraping softly while they muttered prayers. Every act, no matter how small, became a rebellion against the cold. Even a pot of boiling water was a triumph, a sign that the world could still be tamed for a little while. When travelers passed through, hunters, trappers, or mail riders, they brought stories that burned brighter than fire. They spoke of frozen rivers stretching hundreds of miles, of wolves with eyes that glowed red at night, of entire herds of buffalo standing still in blizzards, statues in the snow. Some said there were places where the cold was so deep that even sound froze, where a gunshot would hang in the air like an echo that refused to fade. The settlers listened, half in fear, half in wonder, and they added their own tales. They spoke of ghost lights seen flickering on distant ridges, of old graves that glowed under the snow, of strangers who vanished between one storm and the next. The line between myth and memory blurred easily in those days. Truth was whatever kept people awake. Firelight made the shadows dance, and sometimes the shadows looked back. A few said they had seen shapes moving beyond the tree line, too large for animals, too human to be imagined. But when morning came, the snow was smooth, untouched. The frontier had always bred stories, but in winter they took on a life of their own. Fear was as real a companion as hunger or cold, and yet, in its own way, it kept people alive. When a storm came, one of those great screaming white walls of wind and ice, the world simply ceased to exist. Cabins disappeared beneath drifts, doors frozen shut, windows sealed by frost. The air became a weapon. It sliced through cloth and skin alike. People huddled together in silence, wrapped in blankets, breathing into one another's shoulders to share heat. The fire roared like an animal, fighting against the suffocating cold that pressed at the walls. Outside, the blizzard sang a wild, terrible song that rose and fell for hours, sometimes days. The sound could drive a person mad if they listened too long, for there was something almost human in it, something that made people think the wilderness itself was alive, mocking them. When the wind finally died and the door could be forced open again, what lay beyond was another kind of silence, the silence of an emptied world. Trees snapped in half by ice, dead livestock buried under white mounds, paths erased. Time reset. In that moment, every breath of warmth felt miraculous. The settlers would step outside, blinking in the sudden brightness, and look upon the world with awe and exhaustion. The snow glittered like broken glass, and their own reflections shimmered faintly in the frost. They had survived, but survival in the Wild West was never free. It took a piece of something, a bit of strength, a bit of soul. Each winter asked for tribute, and those who gave enough were allowed to see the spring. The rest became part of the landscape, their names fading into the snowdrifts. Yet, when night came again, they would gather once more around the fire, telling stories of how they had endured, how the cold had tried to break them and failed. There was pride in their voices, not arrogance, but the quiet pride of those who had faced nature's cruelty and stood unbroken. They did not conquer the winter. They endured it, and that was enough. It was never about glory, never about wealth or land, only the stubborn will to keep the fire burning one more night. As the winters in the Wild West pressed on year after year, those who survived began to understand a truth that few outsiders ever grasped, that survival was never just about food or fire, but about learning what truly mattered when everything else was stripped away. In the cities back east, wealth was measured in gold, in fine clothes, in comfort. But out here, comfort itself was the rarest form of luxury. No amount of silver coins could keep the frost from creeping through the walls at night. No fine coat could stop the wind from slicing through the seams. The rich, who had come west, with their trunks full of silk, porcelain, and imported wine, soon found that the wilderness had no respect for luxury. Silk tore against the rough wood of the cabins, porcelain cracked in the cold, and wine froze solid in its bottles. The land equalized everyone, turning merchant and trapper, farmer and prospector, into the same desperate creature before the fire. There was something cruelly democratic about the cold. It humbled all who tried to rise above it. Yet, even in such equality, a strange hierarchy still emerged. Those who had learned the rhythms of the wilderness, who knew how to build, mend, trap, and burn, were the new aristocrats, their skill more valuable than gold. Men who had once been servants now taught their former masters how to keep a fire from dying in the night. Women who had never stepped into kitchens in their eastern homes now baked bread in iron pots, their hands cracked and blackened from smoke. The boundaries of class melted faster than snow near a flame, and yet, for all its brutality, the West had a strange way of giving back to those who endured it. Every morning that a person woke to find themselves still breathing, every night they watched their fire dance, felt like a victory. Those who once dreamed of mansions now found beauty in the simplest things: a patch of sunlight breaking through the frost, the creak of thawing wood, the faint smell of pine. People spoke softly of wealth, but it no longer meant money. It meant the ability to share a blanket, to spare a log for someone else's fire, to have enough food for one more day. In a world that froze everything it touched, generosity became the rarest form of heat. There were stories told of strangers knocking on cabin doors during the worst storms, faces white with frost, voices barely human. And though supplies were scarce, though hunger and fear were constant companions, the doors were always open. It wasn't kindness, not really. It was an understanding that out there, in the frozen wild, a closed door was a death sentence. There was a kind of unspoken law in the wilderness. No one survived alone. Travelers shared food, tools, even stories, because silence could drive a person mad faster than starvation. Around the fire, people became storytellers by necessity, weaving old memories and half-truths into something that kept everyone awake, aware, and connected. Some told of lives before the cold, of green fields and gentle rain, of laughter that didn't echo against frozen walls. Others invented tales of creatures in the mountains, frost spirits, winter ghosts, hunters who walked the snow without leaving footprints. The children listened wide-eyed, their faces orange in the flickering glow, while the adults sat in silence, staring into the flames as if they might see their own pasts in the embers. The cold took many things, but it also gave something strange in return: clarity. In the endless quiet of winter, people began to hear their own thoughts, to weigh their choices, to see how small and fragile their ambitions truly were. The traders and ranchers who had once chased fortune across the plains began to slow down. Some stopped entirely, realizing that gold and silver could not be eaten, could not be burned. Others turned their wagons into homes, planting roots where once they had sought profit. The Wild West, for all its reputation of chaos and freedom, slowly transformed into a place of endurance, where the greatest measure of success was not how much you owned, but how well you survived. The cold sculpted the people as it sculpted the land, carving them into harder, leaner, quieter beings. They no longer dreamed of escape. Instead, they dreamed of spring, of mud and rain and green shoots breaking through the snow. That dream, fragile as it was, kept them alive. Yet, the cold always found its way back, no matter how many fires were lit or how many layers were worn. It became a companion, a shadow that followed them even into sleep. Some nights, when the wind howled and the walls trembled, people swore they could hear whispers, not from ghosts, but from the land itself. The West had a voice, old and knowing, and it seemed to say, "You do not belong here. You endure only because I allow it." And perhaps that was true. For every person who survived a winter, another vanished, swallowed by snow or silence. There were graves buried under drifts, unmarked, forgotten by all but the wind. Still, the living built fires, told stories, and faced the dawn with frost in their beards and determination in their eyes to survive the wild. West winter was not simply to outlast it, it was to be transformed by it. Those who endured were never the same. The cold stripped away vanity, greed, and fear, until only the essential self remained. In that sense, the wilderness was not just a test, but a kind of truth. The land asked a single question of everyone who came to it. What are you when everything else is gone? When the first tracks of snow formed across the vast plains of the Wild West, it marked not only the beginning of winter, but also the slow death of travel, trade, and connection. The roads, little more than trails, beaten by wagon wheels and horse hooves, became icy traps, slick as glass, buried beneath shifting layers of frost that could swallow a man whole. The mail riders, the trappers, the peddlers who carried goods from one distant settlement to another, all faced the same frozen desolation. The distances between towns grew longer in winter, not because the miles increased, but because time itself seemed to freeze. The wind blew ceaselessly, reshaping the land, erasing paths, filling valleys, and burying fences until nothing looked familiar. Travelers often joked that in the West, winter didn't just change the weather, it changed the world entirely. What was once a road might now be a river of ice. What was once a home might now be a tomb beneath snow. Those who dared the trails tied ropes around their waists before stepping outside, so they could find their way back to their cabins if the whiteout came suddenly, and it always did. The blizzards arrived without warning, swallowing men and horses alike in a whirl of blind, howling fury. The wind screamed like a living thing, tearing at clothes, burning exposed skin with a chill that cut deeper than any knife. The few who traveled in such times learned to move like shadows, silent and efficient. They wrapped their faces in scarves, their hands in rough leather mitts, their eyes squinting against the glare. They carried no unnecessary weight, only what could be eaten, burned, or bartered. The frontier was a miser's world. Waste meant death. Even their horses, once proud and wild, became thin and hollow-eyed, their breath steaming in the air like ghosts. Each step forward was a struggle against the unseen, the wind, the cold, the emptiness. There were stories of riders who had fallen asleep in their saddles, their bodies stiffening as they froze, still upright, still facing forward, as if unwilling to admit defeat. Sometimes they were found days later, statues on horseback, eyes rimmed with frost. People whispered about them with reverence and fear, calling them the silent riders. Souls too stubborn, to stop moving. Yet, even in this unforgiving landscape, trade continued. Human need was stronger than weather. A few brave souls, driven by hunger or greed, turned the frozen roads into their domain. They became legends in their own right, smugglers of warmth, carrying whiskey, salt, and lamp oil between towns. Some brought letters from loved ones far away, risking frostbite and wolves for a handful of coins. Others dealt in darker goods, opium, stolen furs, weapons, anything that could bring profit to those willing to gamble with death. The frozen frontier made everyone equal, but desperation created new hierarchies. A man with a sack of coal could command more power than a banker. A woman with a store of candles could be wealthier than a merchant. The cold turned value upside down, made survival itself the only currency that mattered. There were times when entire caravans disappeared into the storms, swallowed by the white sea of winter. Weeks later, their wagons would be found, half buried, wheels frozen solid, their contents scattered by wind and wolves. People would salvage what they could, wrapping themselves in the lost blankets of the dead, whispering quiet prayers of thanks and sorrow. The wilderness cared little for mourning. It devoured everything with the same indifference. But amid that cruelty, there was a strange kind of beauty. The ice on the rivers shimmered like glass, catching the dim light of the sun and scattering it in fragments. The silence of the plains was absolute, so deep that even a single crow's cry could seem like thunder. At night, the stars burned brighter than in any city, their light cold and clean, as though the heavens themselves were frozen. The travelers who camped under them often said the night sky was both their comfort and their curse, vast enough to remind them they were alive, empty enough to make them feel forgotten. In towns that barely survived from one season to the next, the arrival of a traveler in winter was like the arrival of a ghost. People would watch from behind frosted windows as a dark figure approached, trudging through snow, face hidden beneath layers of cloth. Doors opened slowly, cautiously, but once the stranger stepped inside, the warmth of human company returned like a long-lost friend. They would share what they had: a bowl of stew, a place near the fire, a chance to thaw their boots in exchange for news of the world beyond the snow. Sometimes the stories were good: a new settlement rising near the river, a shipment of supplies on its way, a promise that spring was near. But more often, the tales were grim: towns abandoned, families lost, trails impassable. Still, people listened, not because they sought hope, but because they feared silence more in the endless cold. Even bad news was proof that life still moved, somewhere beyond their frozen horizon. Each passing year taught the same lesson again and again, that fortune in the Wild West was not measured by gold or cattle or acres of land, but by endurance. The men and women who walked those frozen roads understood that the only true wealth was to see another dawn. They learned to read the sky like scripture, to feel the snow with their palms, to listen for the faint hum of the wind that signaled a storm's approach. The land demanded this wisdom, and it gave nothing freely. But for those who listened, who adapted, there was something almost holy in the act of surviving. When spring finally came, it wasn't joy they felt, but disbelief, a quiet awe that they had once again outlasted the impossible. By the heart of winter, warmth had become a currency more valuable than gold, and every spark of fire carried a story of sacrifice. The settlers in the Wild West learned quickly that the real struggle was not against bandits, famine, or loneliness was against the cold itself, that silent, invisible enemy that seeped into every breath and heartbeat. The fire was not just a comfort, it was a boundary between life and death, and to keep it burning meant giving something up. Every log of wood burned was a piece of the forest gone forever. Every flame a reminder of how little stood between survival and oblivion. In the beginning, people built great bonfires, believing the woods were endless and forgiving. But by the third month of frost, when the snowdrifts towered higher than fences and the rivers had frozen into glass, the fires grew smaller. Families began to ration not only food but light, counting their embers as carefully as coins. Those who had once traded goods in the marketplace now traded warmth, offering firewood, coal, or candles for a loaf of bread, a length of cloth, or a tin of salt. The rich, who had once prided themselves on possessions, learned humility before the hearth. A single burning log could buy a man's loyalty, a woman's forgiveness, or a stranger's gratitude. Warmth, like mercy, was something only the desperate could understand. There were nights when the cold pressed so hard against the walls that it seemed to breathe, whispering through the cracks, promising rest to those who dared to sleep. Children were taught early never to lie too close to the fire, lest they roll into it, but also never too far, lest they freeze. The balance between warmth and death was delicate, fragile as a thread. Some built clever stoves from clay and stone, hoarding the heat long after the flames died down. Others learned to burn anything that would catch: barrels, tools, furniture, even pieces of wagons. The wood that once carried them west now carried them through the winter. The wealthy families who had filled their cabins with carved chairs, tables, and decorative trinkets found themselves feeding those very things to the flames, watching their symbols of refinement turn to smoke. The cold had no respect for beauty or status. It consumed all without distinction. As the storms deepened, neighbors grew closer, not out of friendship, but necessity. People learned to share what they had, to huddle together in the same cabins, bodies pressed for heat, breath mingling in the dark. Privacy became a luxury that no one could afford. A mother might cradle not only her own child, but another's, the two families bound by the shared rhythm of survival. Men who once distrusted one another shared blankets and silence, knowing that suspicion wasted energy better spent on endurance. In that strange communion of hardship, something raw and human reawakened, sense that all were equal before the cold. The frontier, for all its brutality, stripped away every illusion of control and left only truth that survival was not earned by strength or cleverness, but by cooperation. Those who hoarded their warmth often did not last. It was the sharers who saw spring. There were those, though, who could not share, who saw in the desperation of others an opportunity. The cold bred cruelty as easily as compassion. Some hoarded firewood and sold it at outrageous prices. Others stole from their neighbors, sneaking into cabins under moonlight to take what they could. There were even whispers of darker deeds of those who disappeared into the blizzard and were later found with strange marks on their hands, their fire still burning, but their eyes hollow and wild. The cold, people said, could twist a man's mind as surely as hunger. Once it seeped in deep enough, it made you forget right and wrong, made you worship only the flame. The fire's glow became hypnotic, its warmth a cruel reminder that it could both save and destroy. It was said that some grew so obsessed with its light that they burned more than they needed, chasing a comfort that could never last. Their cabins went up in roaring infernos, and they vanished into smoke victims, not of winter, but of their own longing for heat. Still, for every act of greed or madness, there were 10 of grace. There were the women who spent sleepless nights tending fires for the sick, their faces lined with exhaustion but soft with resolve. There were the old men who gave away their last logs so the young might live. And there were the wanderers who, even at the edge of death, carried embers in tin cans from one settlement to another, sharing their fire like pilgrims bearing relics. To these people, warmth was no longer just a physical comfort, it was a symbol of defiance, proof that humanity could outlast even the wildest cruelty of nature. When the nights stretched longest, and the moon hung pale over the frozen plains, the world seemed suspended between time and eternity. The crackling of the fire was the only heartbeat, the only sound that proved the world still turned. Some said that if you listened long enough to the wind, you could hear the laughter of those who had not made it, drifting across the ice like a lullaby. But even that ghostly song could not silence the will of the living. They built their fires higher, wrapped themselves in furs, and told stories not to forget the cold, but to remind themselves that they still existed in spite of it. And so, the price of warmth was paid in wood, in hunger, in sleepless nights, and in the memory of all that was lost. But those who paid it did not regret the cost, for the flame, however small, was their proof of victory. When dawn came, faint and gray, they would step outside, watching the smoke rise from their chimneys like prayers to the sky. The cold would return. Of course, it always did, but for that single moment, as their breath steamed in the morning light, they would know they had won. The Wild West was never meant for comfort, it was meant for the bold, the desperate, and the dreamers who believed that beyond the mountains, something better waited. But in the cruel heart of winter, that dream froze. The land that had once seemed endless and full of promise became a white, silent graveyard of frozen rivers and buried trails. The air itself became heavy and sharp, cutting through cloth and skin like a blade. Horses collapsed mid-journey, their breath turning into mist that lingered before fading into the gray. Wagons stood abandoned on snow-covered plains, their wheels locked in ice, their cargo forgotten. Even the bravest frontiersmen learned, fear not of men, but of silence. The kind of silence that crept in after the wind stopped howling, when the only sound left was the crack of freezing wood or the distant cry of something dying. It was in that silence that people realized just how small they were, how fragile even the strongest heart could be when nature turned her face away. Those who had set out west with hopes of gold or freedom soon discovered that survival itself was the truest treasure. Men who had once spoken proudly of independence now prayed for the sight of another campfire, another sign of life. The journey across the frozen frontier tested more than muscle, it tested spirit. To walk through knee-deep snow with the wind clawing at your eyes, your breath freezing in your beard, was to fight against the very air. Every step became a battle, every breath of victory. Some wrapped their faces in rags and animal hides until they could no longer feel the world, while others moved like ghosts, covered in frost, their movements slow, deliberate, mechanical. There was no time for beauty, no space for comfort. The horizon was white, the sky was gray, and the world felt endless. Days and nights blended into one long, frozen moment. Food became a memory, whispered more than experienced. The hunt, which had once been sport, turned desperate. Tracks were rare, and when they appeared, they often led to nothing but bones. Hunters followed shadows, sometimes for days, only to return. Those who managed to trap a rabbit or a bird treated it as a feast fit for kings. There were stories of settlers boiling leather belts and animal hides just to draw out the faintest taste of sustenance, of men chewing on bark and snow until their lips bled. And yet, for all the suffering, there was a strange beauty to it, a terrible, quiet beauty in watching the sun rise over a frozen river, painting the world in pale gold. It was a world untouched by greed or noise, pure in its cruelty. The cold did something else to it, changed the people. It stripped them bare, peeling away the layers of arrogance and comfort until only truth remained. Those who had boasted of their strength began to crumble, while the quiet ones, the ones who had endured without complaint, became unbreakable. It was no longer about who had the most supplies or the best guns. It was about who could keep going when everything hurt, when hope was nothing but a flicker behind frost-bitten eyes. Families that had traveled west together began to fragment, not out of anger, but exhaustion. Some gave up and turned back east, though most never made it home. The land swallowed them, and by spring, their names were just another whisper in the wind. Still, even in the face of that frozen hopelessness, there were sparks of defiance. There were those who refused to bow, who built fires against the wind and laughed in its face. They sang songs, quiet, trembling songs that no one would ever write down, songs about home, about spring, about warmth they could barely remember. It was those songs that kept them human. The settlers learned to measure time not by days but by flames. One night's fire meant another day alive. They burned anything that would catch wagon planks, fences, even the handles of tools. The smoke from their fires rose into the gray sky like a promise, a message to anyone watching that humanity still flickered here, refusing to be snuffed out. There was a legend told among the travelers then of a woman known as the Lantern Keeper. No one knew her name, but every survivor swore they'd seen her at least once, a solitary figure walking through the snow at night, carrying a glowing lantern. Some said she was a ghost of a mother who had lost her children in a blizzard, doomed to wander forever, lighting the way for others. Others said she was Rila Trapper's widow who had turned her grief into mercy, traveling between camps to share her fire with strangers. Whatever she was, her light became a symbol of survival. When the snowstorm raged hardest and all seemed lost, people looked to the horizon, praying to see that faint golden glow cutting through the dark. To believe she existed was to believe hope still did too. When morning came, if you could call it morning, for the sun barely rose, the survivors moved slow, conserving what little strength remained. Every mile gained was a victory written in frost and pain. Their faces were raw, their fingers numb, but their spirits clung stubbornly to life. Some carried keepsakes, locket, a letter. a child's wooden toy knot, as reminders of what was lost, but as anchors for what still mattered. In that frozen wasteland, where time seemed to stop and mercy felt like a forgotten word, the smallest act of love was rebellion. A shared meal, a lit fire, a held hand, these were revolutions against the cold. And so, the frozen frontier became more than just a landscape. It became a mirror. It showed people who they really were, stripped of everything but will. Those who survived it would never be the same. They would carry the memory of the cold in their bones, the echo of its silence in their dreams. They would speak of it rarely, because how could words ever capture what it meant to outlive winter itself? By the time the settlers reached the foothills of the northern ranges, the world had turned into a furnace of frost. Every breath burned their lungs. Every gust of wind carried shards of invisible ice. The plains were gone now, replaced by jagged peaks, where the snow never melted and the rivers ran sluggish beneath a crust of glass. The few who remained from the caravans of the fall were no longer travelers. They were survivors, carved from cold and silence. Their laughter had long vanished, replaced by the steady rhythm of boots crunching over snow, the occasional creak of frozen leather, the faint groan of wind through pine. The world had become narrow, reduced to the few feet of white before their eyes and the endless gray above. And yet, even here, even in this kingdom of deathly stillness, the settlers learned something profound. That warmth was not a gift from nature, but a creation of will. Fire became their god. Not the golden warmth of hearths in cities back east, but the fierce, fragile flame that flickered in the wilderness, one spark against a sea of darkness. It took skill to make it, patience to keep it, and courage to defend it. Men gathered pine, resin, and dry moss from beneath snow-covered roots. Women cupped their trembling hands around the faint glow, as if protecting a newborn. The fire was more than light. Tight was memory, companionship, and life distilled into a single, trembling point of color. They huddled around it at night, telling stories not of the past, but of dreams. The scent of spring grass, the sound of a river thawing, the laughter of children in sunlit fields. The flames painted their faces in copper and gold, turning exhaustion into something almost holy. Yet, for all their reverence, fire was a fickle ally. The wind would come roaring down from the mountains without warning, snapping through the trees like a ghostly hand. It could strip warmth from the air in seconds, extinguish a campfire, and send a dozen men scrambling to rebuild it with frozen fingers. The settlers learned to dig into the earth, to shield their flames with stones, to sleep in shifts so that someone was always awake to guard the light. The nights grew longer, and the line between sleep and death. Some never woke, their faces peaceful beside the dying glow, as if the fire had taken their last breath for itself. Others raved in fever, seeing figures in the snow faces they once knew, voices calling them to rest. The wind carried whispers, and not all of them came from the living. One evening, deep in the heart of that brutal winter, a storm rose that no one could have imagined. The sky itself seemed to collapse, and the snow came sideways, choking and endless. For 3 days and nights, the settlers could not see beyond an arm's length. Their tents were buried, their fires drowned in drifts, their spirits tested beyond breaking. It was during that storm that the old man everyone called Doc made a choice that became legend. He was not truly a doctor, just a wanderer with a box of herbs and a heart too stubborn to quit. When the wind howled loudest and the last fire sputtered out, he crawled from the tent, wrapped in furs and frost, carrying a single ember cupped in a tin cup. He vanished into the white, following the sound of crying he swore he heard through the storm. They found him the next day, frozen to the waist, the ember still glowing faintly between his palms. He had reached another camp half a mile away and reignited their flame. He didn't speak again, but when he died that night, they buried him beneath the snow with his cup beside him. They said the ember never went out. From that day on, the settlers called Fire Doc's gift. Children who were born years later, when the world had softened, grew up hearing the tale. They would sit by the hearth and listen as their grandparents whispered, "The cold can take everything but the fire you carry inside." It became more than folklore, it was survival philosophy. For the settlers, warmth was no longer something found. It was something made, fought for, shared. They built stone hearths inside caves and dugouts, sealing the openings with hides and snow to trap every wisp of heat. Some carried tiny embers with them in metal tins, passing them from one group to another, as if trading hope itself. But warmth came at a cost. To keep the flames alive, they burned everything: wood, wagons, furniture, even family Bibles. There was a quiet sorrow in that act, watching pages of scripture curl and blacken, watching the stories that had comforted generations turn to ash. Yet in the dance of those flames, they saw something divine, proof that faith was not in words, but in endurance. The Bible burned, but the spirit it carried survived. The settlers came to see the cold not as punishment, but as a teacher, ruthless, unrelenting one. It taught them humility, patience, and the strength to find beauty even in desolation. When the blizzards passed and the world grew quiet again, they stepped out into the light and saw the land anew. The snow sparkled like crushed diamonds, the rivers glowed blue beneath their icy shells, and the mountains stood eternal and untouched. It was as if creation itself had been reset. For the first time, they saw what the land demanded: respect. The Wild West was no enemy, no prize to be conquered. It was a presence. To live there was not to dominate it, but to learn its rhythm, to move with its storms, to listen to its silence. The settlers who survived the winter carried that wisdom deep within them. They began to build differently, hunt differently, live differently. They learned to read the color of the clouds, the way the wind bent the grass, the sound of snow crunching beneath boots. They could smell a storm before it came, could tell the temperature by the tone of their breath in the air. They became something new, not just settlers, but part of the land itself. When spring finally came, it was not with fanfare, but with a whisper. The ice cracked, the first trickle of water ran beneath the drifts, and the trees began to wake. The settlers wept not with joy, but with reverence. They had seen the edge of the world and returned from it. The fires they built that spring were not just for warmth, but for remembrance. Around them, they planted the first seeds, not because they were hungry, but because they believed the earth would give back what they had endured. And in every flickering flame, in every ember carried across the wind, there remained the memory of Doc's gift, a reminder that sometimes the smallest light is enough to hold back the coldest night. when the first drops of melted snow began to slide down from the mountains. They came not with fanfare, but in quiet defiance, as if nature itself was uncertain whether to allow spring to return to the land that had endured so much suffering. The world that had been white and soundless for endless weeks began to hum again. Soft at first, the faint drip of water from icicles, the creak of thawing trees, the sigh of rivers waking beneath their icy shells. For the settlers who had survived the brutal cold, this subtle music was the sweetest sound they had ever heard. They had spent months wrapped in silence so thick it felt eternal. Silence broken only by the crack of frozen wood or the last groan of dying men. Now, the whisper of running water carried a promise that life, after all, had not abandoned them. Men and women emerged from their dugouts like ghosts returning from another world. Their faces were pale, their bodies thin, their hands scarred by frostbite, but their eyes, once hollow and distant, now held a strange and quiet fire. They were not the same people who had set out into the wild months ago. The cold had stripped away every illusion, every softness, and what remained was something raw, enduring, and profoundly human. The thaw did not come easily. It came in fits and stutters, as if the land itself was testing their patience one last time. Days of warmth would be followed by sudden storms, and rivers swollen with meltwater would flood the valleys, sweeping away what little the settlers had managed to preserve. Yet, even as nature played its cruel games, the people did not curse it. They had learned respect in the heart of winter. Now they learned gratitude. The sound of rain was no longer a nuisance, it was a blessing. The smell of wet earth beneath their boots was a miracle. They began to rebuild with hands that shook, not from fear, but from reverence. Wood that had once been hoarded for fire became beams for new shelters. Frozen fields were dug open, the soil beneath black and rich, ready to bear life again. They planted seeds in the same earth that had nearly taken them, each one a small act of faith, a defiant whisper that said, "We are still here." With the thaw came movement. The rivers turned from ice to mirrors, reflecting the pale sky as if the heavens themselves had descended to rest upon the land. The settlers built rafts, crossing to places they had only dreamed of before the winter came. Trade began again, slow and uncertain, with the exchange of dried meat, tools, and the rarest treasure of all stories. In those stories lived the memory of the frozen months, of Doc and his ember, of the lantern keeper and her wandering light, of nameless souls who had vanished into snowdrifts, but whose courage had not been forgotten. Each retelling was both mourning and celebration, a way of giving meaning to the suffering. The children, too young to remember the worst of the cold, listened wide-eyed by the fire, their imaginations painting the white world their parents spoke of. To them, the winter was not horror, was legend, but even legends left scars. Some nights, when the wind blew just right, the settlers would grow silent. The sound carried echoes of the storms, and for a moment they were back there again in the blinding white, with the fire guttering low and the cold breathing down their necks. Those moments were fleeting, but they left a chill deeper than any frost. Still, there was no bitterness in their silence, only remembrance. They did not curse the winter, they thanked it. Without it, they might never have understood the worth of warmth, of water, of each other. Survival had changed them all, and not merely in body. It had bound them together in a way no oath or law could dot by mid-spring. The landscape had transformed so completely it was almost unrecognizable. Where once there had been desolation, now there were rivers running swift and clear, meadows speckled with wildflowers, and hillsides streaked with green. The settlers' children ran barefoot through the mud, laughing, their voices echoing across valleys that had once been silent tombs. The sight brought tears to their parents' eyes. To see joy again after so much suffering felt unreal, almost sacred. They celebrated not with feast, they had too little for that, but with song. Old tunes carried from the east mixed with new ones born from the frontier. Melodies that told of snow and fire, of despair and endurance. Around the campfires, voices rose into the night air, weaving together the past and the present in one long thread of memory. As spring deepened, so too did their bond with the land. They learned the ways of the mountains, the safe passes, the dangerous slopes, the valleys where the snow lingered longest. They mapped the streams and the meadows, named the peaks after those who had perished, and built their settlements not as invaders, but as caretakers. The Wild West was still untamed, still filled with threats, wolves, bandits, storms, but the settlers faced them differently now. The cold had taught them that fear could be survived, that hope could be built from ashes and frost. It had also taught them compassion. When new travelers arrived, weary and starving, no one turned them away. Fires were shared, food was divided, and the story of survival was passed down like a sacred text. The thaw also brought strange visitors for traders from the north, miners from the east, wanderers who claimed to have seen the Pacific. They came with tales of distant lands, of golden valleys and towering forests untouched by man. The settlers listened, curious but unmoved. They had already found their paradise, not in wealth or ease, but in endurance. Their land, harsh and unforgiving as it was, had become home. Each sunrise over the thawed plains reminded them that they had won a battle few could understand. They had fought nature herself and, somehow, earned her respect in time. The first true town emerged from what had been a scatter of camps and dugouts. It was nothing grand and a trading post, but to those who built it, it was the heart of a new world. They named it Ember's Rest in honor of Doc's final flame. At the center of the town, they built a great stone hearth that was never allowed to go out. Even when summer came and the nights were warm, the fire burned a reminder that warmth, once won, must be guarded. Travelers passing through would gather around it, warming their hands, listening to the settlers' quiet stories. And when the first snow of the next winter fell, soft and silent over the town, no one was afraid. They knew now that the cold was not an ending but a test, and they were ready. The thaw had brought warmth, but with it came temptation. And nowhere was that temptation stronger than in the glittering veins of gold whispered to lie beneath the western hills. The settlers of Ember's Rest, once content with survival and peace, began to hear rumors carried on the tongues of traders and wanderers. Rumors of rivers that shone with flakes of gold beneath the sun, of mountains whose stones could be crushed into fortune. It began as idle talk, a dream muttered by the fire after long days of work. But dreams in the Wild West were dangerous things. They had the power to awaken the old hunger in men, the same hunger that had driven them to cross deserts and face storms, the same hunger that now stirred again under the illusion of wealth. For many, the memory of the long winter began to fade beneath the golden shimmer of greed. Men who had once vowed to live humbly began sharpening their tools and whispering to their neighbors, "Just a little gold, and then we'll rest." But the West had never been kind to those who sought more than they needed. When the first miners set out from Ember's Rest, the townsfolk watched them go with a mix of awe and unease. They carried picks and shovels instead of rifles, but their faces had that same wild light that came before tragedy. The hills they climbed were still streaked with snow, the rivers swollen and treacherous from the melt. Within weeks, stories came back of success, tiny specks of gold found in pans, enough to ignite the fever in even the most cautious heart. The quiet town began to stir with excitement. New arrivals flooded in, prospectors, gamblers, drifters, and men who had fled debts or crimes. The sound of hammers and shovels replaced the old songs of survival, and the air filled with dust and ambition. The frozen silence of the frontier was gone, replaced by the restless noise of men chasing fortune. Ember's Rest began to change. The simple stone hearth that had once burned for warmth now burned for profit. Merchants arrived with crates of whiskey and promises of equipment. Blacksmiths worked day and night forging tools. Even the preacher, whose sermons once spoke of endurance and humility, began to talk of blessings disguised as gold. Yet, beneath the surface, something darker stirred. The same fire that had once saved them from the cold now threatened to consume them from within. Men quarreled over claims and cheated their partners. Fights broke out in the muddy streets, and the once pure river ran cloudy with silt and greed. The winter had taught them how to survive together, but the gold taught them how easily unity could fracture. And then, as if to remind them that nature does not forget, the weather turned once more. The spring rains grew heavier than anyone had seen before, washing through the mining camps like a warning. Rivers overflowed, flooding the valleys where men had dug too greedily. Whole camps were swept away in a single night, their fires drowned, their tents torn and scattered across the plains. The mountains, too, seemed to revolt. Rock slides crushed paths and buried tunnels, and those who had chased the deepest veins were trapped beneath the same earth they had hoped would make them rich. The survivors staggered back to Ember's Rest, their faces hollow, their hands empty. The town that had been born of endurance now looked upon the cost of ambition. In the quiet that followed the storm, the settlers gathered once more by the hearth. The fire burned low, its light flickering across faces drawn tight with shame and sorrow. The preacher spoke softly, his voice heavy with understanding. "The cold taught us what it means to live," he said, "but the gold has shown us what it means to lose ourselves." No one argued. They all knew it was true. The dream of wealth had come and gone like a fever, leaving only exhaustion behind. Many of those who had come chasing fortune packed their belongings and moved on, searching for the next glimmer of promise in the endless expanse of the West. Ember's Rest remained, but its heart was bruised. Still, not all lessons are cruel. Among the survivors of the mining camps were those who returned, changed, not bitter, but wise. They had seen what greed could do, and they wanted no part of it anymore. They spoke, instead of building, of planting, of raising families in peace. The women of the town, who had watched husbands and brothers vanish into the hills, took charge of rebuilding the community. They reforged what the storms had taken, turning grief into resilience. The town grew quieter, steadier. The forge rang again, but this time for tools of life plows, hinges, cooking pots. The fields that had lain dormant through the cold now rippled with wheat and barley. Children's laughter returned to the air, mingling with the song of river birds that had come back with the spring. And yet, somewhere deep in the hills, the promise of gold still slept beneath the rocks, waiting. The settlers knew it was there. They could feel it, but none spoke of digging again. It was not fear that stopped them, but wisdom. They had learned that the greatest treasures of the West were not buried in the ground, but in the bonds forged through fire and frost. The memory of the winter still lived in them, a silent reminder that survival was its own kind of gold. They tended the hearth as carefully as they once tended the fire in their camps, knowing that warmth was worth more than all the riches in the earth. As night fell over Ember's Rest, the mountains glowed faintly under the rising moon. The river ran clear again, reflecting the stars like scattered jewels. The people sat together outside their homes, wrapped in blankets, sharing quiet stories. Somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf howled, not in hunger, but in mourning, and the sound carried across the valley like a prayer. They listened, not with fear, but with reverence. They understood now what the frontier truly demanded: not conquest, not greed, but respect. The rains had ended, and the earth was soft again. The smell of mud and pine filled the air as dawn crept over the mountains, painting the sky in pale silver. Ember's Rest lay quiet under the light mist, its chimneys still smoking from the night before. The town, once restless with the fever of gold, now breathed in silence, as if the land itself was exhaling after holding its breath for too long. But beneath that silence, there was an emptiness that no sunlight could touch. The laughter that once echoed through the saloon had died away. The clang of hammers, the songs of miners, the bustling shout-saw were gone. The fires that once burned so fiercely had faded to gentle embers, and the people were left to face what remained after the storm. Most of those who had survived the floods spent their days repairing what could be saved. The broken bridge over Black River was rebuilt with stronger wood. The roads, washed out by the rain, were leveled again by calloused hands. There was a determination in every swing of the hammer, but also a quiet grief. The miners who had drowned were buried on the hill overlooking the valley, their graves marked not with gold, but with simple wooden crosses. Each one told a story of a man who had dreamed too much, a son who never returned, a friend who vanished beneath the rushing waters. The wind that passed over those graves carried with it the ghosts of their ambitions, whispering softly to those who still walked below. This land takes what it is owed. Among those who mourned was a woman named Clara Hensley. Her husband, Samuel, had been one of the first to venture into the hills during the gold rush. He had promised her he'd return rich enough to build them a new home with glass windows and a porch that looked out toward the sunrise. But when the storm came, he never made it back. Every evening, Clara sat by the riverbank where his camp once stood, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, watching the water move. Sometimes she thought she could still see his lantern flicker beneath the current, dancing just out of reach. The townsfolk often passed her in silence, unwilling to disturb her vigil. She became a quiet symbol of the cost of dreams, a reminder of what the cold and greed could steal from the heart. The preacher, Father Alcott, tried to rekindle faith in the weary souls of Ember's Rest. He spoke of renewal, of the way the earth must break before it can bloom again. But his sermons had changed too. They were no longer about heaven or sin, but about forgiveness and endurance. Fire purifies, he would say, standing before his small congregation. And though we have been burned, we still stand. The people listened, not because they believed in miracles, but because his words gave them comfort in a world that often seemed to forget mercy. Even those who had once mocked faith began to attend his gatherings, sitting quietly beneath the cracked wooden beams of the church. But not all who survived were content to stay. Some saw Ember's Rest as cursed ground. They said the earth here was tainted, that no good could grow where men had bled for gold. In the weeks that followed, families packed their wagons and left, following the trails east or south toward rumored lands of promise. Each departure left the town emptier, quieter. The blacksmith closed his shop for days at a time. The saloon keeper began boarding up his windows. And for a while, it seemed as though Ember's Rest would simply fade back into the wilderness, forgotten like so many ghost towns before it. Yet, even in decline, life has a way of persisting. One morning, as the mist lifted from the valley, the townspeople woke to find wildflowers growing where the floodwaters had torn through the ground. Bright colors, violet, crimson, gold sprang up along the riverbank like tiny sparks of hope. The soil that had been washed clean by the rains was now fertile, and soon the settlers began to plant gardens again. The women gathered seeds from what little they had saved, and the men worked the fields with renewed purpose. It was slow, difficult work, but it gave them something to hold on to, a future not built on dreams of gold, but on the quiet dignity of survival. Clara was among the first to plant her garden. She chose the hill overlooking Samuel's grave, sowing seeds of lavender and sage. He liked the smell, she said softly to the preacher when he came to bless the soil. Maybe now he can rest easy. In time, the garden grew wild and fragrant. The scent of herbs carried on the evening breeze down into the valley. It became a place of peace where the people would come to sit and remember, not with sorrow, but with gratitude for the lives that had been spared. The old fire pit in the center of town, once the gathering place for miners' boasts and gamblers' tales, was rebuilt too. But now it served a different purpose. Every evening, when the work was done, the townsfolk would light the fire and sit around it, sharing stories, not of riches or loss, but of kindness. A traveler who had shared his last loaf of bread, a stranger who had pulled another from the flood, a mother who had walked miles through snow to fetch medicine for her child. Slowly, those stories began to heal what the gold had broken. The people realized that though the fires of greed had faded, another fire, one of humanity's, still burned within them. And so, Ember's Rest lived up to its name once more. It did not blaze with ambition or shine with wealth, but it glowed steadily, like a coal that refuses to die out. It became a haven for those seeking quiet, for those who had grown tired of the noise and madness of the frontier. Travelers passing through would often remark on the strange peace that hung over the town, the way the wind seemed softer, the stars clearer. Some said they could feel the weight of the past here, but not as a burden, rather as a presence that guarded and guided. Years later, when new settlers arrived and asked about the gold, the old ones would simply smile and shake their heads. "There's nothing worth digging for here," they'd say. "The treasure's already been found." They meant the gardens, the laughter of children, the firelight that flickered against old wooden walls. They meant the hard-won calm that only comes after the storm has passed. The wilderness had tested them with hunger, with frost, with greed. They had survived it all, not because they were strong, but because they had learned when to stop fighting and simply endure. And on quiet nights, when the wind rustled through the wildflowers on the hill, Clara's garden still whispered to the earth below a song of love, of loss, and of peace hard-earned. As the years crept onward and the storms became memories, Ember's Rest began to change, not in the way cities grow, with grand monuments or noisy streets, but in the quiet way an old wound begins to heal. The winters were still cold, the winds still merciless, yet something had softened in the valley. Smoke rose gently from chimneys at dawn, carrying with it the scent of baking bread instead of desperation. Children ran barefoot through the fields that once were soaked in blood and gold dust, chasing the wind as if it could carry them somewhere new. The air that had once been thick with greed now held laughter, and the same hills that had witnessed madness and ruin now watched over peace. It was a fragile peace, yes, but it was real land in the Wild West. That was more than most towns ever got. The people of Ember's Rest had learned a hard lesson, that survival was not about wealth or conquest, but about patience. The mountains taught them that. They had seen what happened to those who demanded too much from the earth. So now they took only what they needed and gave back what they could. Each family tended their land carefully, planting crops in small patches where the soil was strongest. They built fences from fallen timber, not to claim ownership, but to keep the wind from stealing their harvests. The river, once feared for its fury, became their ally again. Its waters turned the mill wheels and nourished their fields, humming softly as it passed the town like an old friend returning home. There was a new kind of rhythm to life, measured, deliberate, almost sacred. The saloon, which once echoed with the chaos of dice and drunken laughter, was transformed into a gathering hall. On Sundays, Clara and the other women organized communal meals there. They would cook stews from the week's hunt, bake fresh bread, and set the tables with mismatched plates collected from abandoned homes. It didn't matter that nothing matched. It mattered that everyone had a seat. The same walls that had once held secrets and deceit now rang with the warmth of belonging. Even Father Alcott, whose sermons had grown quieter with age, would sit among them with a cup of cider, smiling faintly as the children played nearby. "This," he would whisper sometimes, "this is what heaven must sound like." At night, the town glowed faintly in the darkness. Not from electric light, they still had none, but from dozens of small oil lamps set carefully in every window. Travelers often said they could see the lights of Ember's Rest from miles away, flickering like stars scattered across the valley floor. They called it the valley that never sleeps, but not because of noise or restlessness, because of its warmth. It was said that no matter how bitter the night or how lost a soul might be, there would always be a light burning in Ember's Rest to guide them home. One evening, a stranger arrived, a man wrapped in a heavy coat, his face half hidden beneath the shadow of a hat. He rode an old, weary horse and carried with him the quiet of someone who had traveled far and seen too much. The townsfolk watched him as he dismounted near the saloon, his boots sinking into the wet earth. He didn't speak much at first, only nodded when offered food and water. But when Clara approached him, offering a seat by the fire, something in his eyes softened. His name was Elias Morgan, a trapper who had once worked the Northern Territories. The wilderness had taken nearly everything from him, his friends, his fortune, and his faith. Yet, as he sat among the people of Ember's Rest, listening to their laughter and stories, he felt something he hadn't known in years: stillness. He stayed. Days turned to weeks, and weeks into seasons. Elias became a quiet figure in the town, repairing tools, helping with hunts, teaching the children how to track animals or read the signs of weather. He never spoke of his past, and no one asked. In the West, every man carried ghosts. It was enough that he carried them with grace. Over time, he and Clara grew close, not in a fiery, reckless way, but with the slow tenderness of two souls who had seen enough loss to know that love was not a promise of forever, but a moment of peace shared between storms. When spring came, they planted a tree together near Samuel's grave, a slender aspen that swayed gently in the breeze. It grew fast, its silver leaves catching the sunlight like coins scattered across the sky. People began calling it the Tree of Mercy, and so Ember's Rest entered a new chapter, not one written in gold or greed, but in endurance and quiet joy. The town became a sanctuary for the lost, a resting place for those who had survived too much of the world. Drifters and travelers who arrived broken often stayed, drawn in by something they couldn't quite name. Some said it was the air, the way it seemed softer here. Others said it was the river's song, or the way the mountains curved around the valley like a mother's arms. But those who had lived there longest knew the truth. It was the people. They had built something rare in the wilderness, a community that didn't just endure hardship, but turned it into grace. The seasons continued to pass, each one leaving its quiet mark. In winter, the fires burned bright, and families huddled close, telling stories of the old days when everything was colder and crueler. In spring, the gardens burst into color again, and the scent of wildflowers drifted down the valley. In summer, the children played by the river, their laughter echoing where once only the roar of floods had been heard. And in autumn, the leaves turned gold, reminding them of the treasure that had cost them so much to learn, that peace, once found, is worth more than all the gold in the world. Years later, when outsiders came through, searching for tales of lost mines or buried fortune, the old folks would smile faintly and say, "You won't find what you're looking for here. What was lost is long gone." But the truth, the deeper truth, lived in every quiet breath the valley took. The wilderness had tested them, broken them, burned them, but in the ashes of what they'd lost, they had found something far greater. Ember's Rest was not just a place anymore, it was a story, a testament to what happens when fire, frost, and human spirit collide and refuse to destroy each other. On a cold winter's night, when the moon hung low and the world seemed frozen still, Clara stood once more on the hill overlooking her garden. The lavender swayed in the wind, silver under the moonlight. She placed her hand on the aspen tree she and Elias had planted, its bark cool and smooth beneath her touch. The town below glowed with a dozen fires flickering through the windows, soft and steady, like the heartbeat of something eternal. She smiled faintly, whispering into the wind. "We made it," the mountains answered with silence. But it was the kind of silence that listens. And when dawn came, its first light fell gently over Ember's Rest, painting it gold, not the kind men kill for, but the kind that reminds them they are alive. Winter returned to Ember's Rest like an old visitor who had never truly left, its breath cold and sharp, creeping through every crack in the wooden walls and every fold of worn blankets. The year had been kind. Spring had brought rain and fertile soil. Summer had filled the valley with warmth and laughter. And autumn had blessed the harvest but as the first snow fell, the townsfolk could feel something different in the air. The wind howled longer, colder. The animals in the hills grew scarce, and the clouds hung heavy over the mountains, gray and unbroken. Yet, within the heart of the town, fires still burned, steady and defiant against the darkness that gathered beyond the ridges. Ember's Rest had weathered so much before. They had learned to respect the cold, not fear it. Still, this winter would test them in ways none had expected. The first weeks passed quietly enough. Children played in the snow, their laughter ringing through the frosted streets. Men chopped wood from dawn till dusk, stacking it in tall piles beside every home. The women busied themselves with canning, preserving the last of the autumn's bounty: peaches, beans, and salted meat stored in glass jars that glittered in the faint firelight. Each household prepared for the long freeze, every gesture of survival done not out of panic but habit. The people of Ember's Rest were no strangers to hardship. They had seen storms that washed away their lives, fires that burned their dreams to ash, and hunger that hollowed their bones. They had learned long ago that endurance was not about conquering the wilderness, but about learning to live alongside it. As the days grew shorter, the snow deepened, blanketing the valley in silence. The river froze over in thick sheets of ice, and the wind that swept through the canyon sang a haunting tune, a reminder of the vast emptiness that still ruled this land. It was during these nights that the townsfolk gathered in the old saloon, now a communal hall, to share warmth and stories. The fire at its center glowed orange and gold, and around it sat the people who had become more than neighbors. They were family forged in frost. Clara and Elias sat together near the hearth, her knitting needles clicking softly while he carved small wooden toys for the children. Father Alcott read from his worn Bible, though his voice was softer now, his eyes dimmer with age. Yet there was peace in his expression, the calm of a man who had finally made peace with his God and his ghosts. But then, as the season deepened, something began to shift. The snow didn't stop. Week after week, it fell relentless, heavy, burying fences, wagons, and even rooftops. The wind screamed louder, carrying with it a chill that bit through the thickest furs. Soon, the food stores began to dwindle. Hunting parties returned empty-handed, the forest too still and lifeless to yield prey. The people tightened their belts and rationed every meal. Still, they endured, lighting candles each night and telling stories to distract themselves from the hunger. "We've survived worse," they said. But deep down, they knew that this winter was different. It carried an edge of finality, like a closing chapter in a book that had been written too long. One night, when the blizzard raged hardest, a knock echoed through Clara's door. She opened it to find a young boy, barely 12, shivering, his clothes soaked with melted snow. He had come from a nearby settlement that had been abandoned weeks ago, his family gone. Clara took him in without question, wrapping him in a blanket, feeding him what little soup she had left. The boy said his name was Jonah, and his voice trembled when he spoke of how the cold had taken everything from him. Elias placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder, saying softly, "You're home now, son." It was a simple promise, but one that carried the weight of everything they had fought for. The promise that no one would face the cold alone. As the storm worsened, the town huddled closer. Every home became a refuge, every act of kindness a spark against the dark. When the fires ran low, they shared what little wood they had. When food grew scarce, they divided it equally, even if it meant going to bed hungry. The people of Ember's Rest understood something few others did that in the Wild West. Survival was not about strength or luck, but about compassion. They remembered the days when greed had nearly destroyed them, when the pursuit of gold had turned neighbors into enemies. Those days were long gone now. In their place was something pure, forged in the quiet resilience of those who refused to let each other fade away. The snowstorm raged for 40 days and nights, cutting off all trails in and out of the valley. Some said it was the harshest winter in 50 years. Yet, when the wind finally eased and the skies cleared, what remained was nothing short of a miracle. The town still stood. The roofs had held, the fires had survived, and though hunger lingered, not a single soul had been lost. The people emerged from their homes, blinking against the dazzling light of morning. The world was pure white, untouched and still. The river sparkled beneath a thin layer of ice, and the sun broke through the clouds like a blessing. For a long time, no one spoke. Then, from somewhere in the distance, the sound of laughter echoed the children, already back to playing, their footprints marking the first signs of life in the snow. That night, as the people gathered once more around the great fire, Clara stood and looked around the circle. Faces illuminated by firelight, eyes weary but bright. "We've come a long way," she said softly. "From the floods, from the fires, from hunger and loss. The world tried to break us, but here we are." Her voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of memory. Maybe this is what we were meant for, not to conquer the land, but to belong to it. Elias smiled faintly, his hand resting over hers. Father Alcott lifted his head and whispered, "Amen." Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and gentle this time, as if the sky itself was tucking the town beneath its blanket in that moment. As the flames crackled and the people of Ember's Rest sat together in warmth and silence, it became clear that this was no longer just a settlement clinging to survival. It was a legacy, a story written in frost and fire, passed down through whispers and memories. The wilderness had tested them one final time, and they had answered with endurance, unity, and grace. And so, the last winter began to fade, not as a cruel ending, but as a quiet dawn, the beginning of peace that would last long after their footprints were gone. By the time the last of the snow began to melt, Ember's Rest had become a ghost of its former self, not because it was empty, but because the winter had left its quiet mark on every wall, every heart, every breath. The wooden fences bowed beneath the weight of frost. The fields lay hidden under a thin crust of ice, and the once bustling paths between homes had turned into narrow trails carved by weary footsteps. Yet, beneath all that stillness, life stirred again. The river began to hum softly as the ice broke and the sun returned, pale but persistent, glinting on every frozen surface like scattered shards of glass. It was a gentle awakening, the kind that came not with music or celebration, but with deep, humble gratitude. The people of Ember's Rest had survived another winter, but this one had left them with something more than scars. It had left them with a story that would not fade. Clara woke early that first morning of thaw, her breath still visible in the cold air. She stepped outside, the snow crunching softly beneath her boots. The valley looked almost new, again the hills draped in mist, the sky clear enough to see where the horizon met the mountains. Elias was already by the stable, tending to the horses that had survived the freeze. He moved slowly, his hands steady despite the chill. "Looks like spring's finally decided to visit," he said with a faint smile, glancing up as Clara approached. She nodded, her eyes catching the faint trail of smoke rising from the other chimneys. "She's late," she murmured, "but she's welcome." The town was quiet that morning, too quiet. People emerged from their homes like sleepers waking from a long dream, blinking at the sunlight. The streets were lined with snowbanks that sparkled under the new day. There was no laughter yet, no chatter, only the soft sounds of shovels scraping ice and boots against slush. But then, slowly, as if the silence itself began to melt, the sound of life returned, doors creaking open, dogs barking, someone calling out a greeting. The air smelled of smoke and thawing earth. It was the scent of hope. By noon, the snow had softened enough that the children began to play again, their red cheeks bright against the white. One of them, Jonathan, boy Clara, had taken in wandered farther than the rest, chasing a small wooden toy Elias had carved for him weeks ago. It rolled down the hill, bouncing off the frozen ground, and came to rest near the edge of the river where the ice had begun to crack. As Jonah reached for it, his hand brushed against something half buried in the melting snow, a small tin box, rusted and cold. Curious, he dug it out and pried it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a letter sealed with wax. He ran back toward the town, shouting for Clara and Elias. The people gathered around as Clara took the letter carefully, her hands trembling slightly. The wax was stamped with a symbol, a crest no one recognized. She opened it slowly, the paper yellowed and brittle, the ink faded but still legible. As she began to read, a hush fell over the crowd. The letter was dated 30 years earlier, written by a man named John Remington, a surveyor for the Western Territories Commission. In his neat handwriting, he described a settlement he had discovered while mapping the Valia small mining camp near the river. Its people desperate but determined. He spoke of how they had offered him food and shelter during a storm, how they had shared their meager supplies without hesitation. He had promised to return with aid to help them build roads, bridges, a future. But the next lines of the letter were heavy with regret. "The government has chosen to abandon this valley," he wrote. "They say it is too remote, too harsh. I am ordered to turn back. But I cannot forget Them, the men, the women, the children who gave everything just to see another spring. If ever this letter is found, know that those who lived here were not forgotten. Their kindness will outlive the gold, and their courage will outlast the snow. When Clara finished reading, no one spoke for a long time. The wind rustled through the melting drifts, carrying the faint creak of the old mill wheel, turning again after months of stillness. Father Alcott removed his hat. He never came back, he said quietly. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the letter wasn't meant for the people who were here. It was meant for the ones who came after. Elias nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the river. He was right, he murmured. The gold is gone, but the kindness, that's still here. The discovery of the letter became something sacred. They placed the tin box in the town hall, beside the fire pit that had once been the heart of every gathering. It was more than a relic. It was proof that their struggles, their lives, had meaning beyond survival, that they were part of something larger, something unseen. In the days that followed, the people began to rebuild again, not just their homes, but their sense of purpose. They repaired fences, redug the fields, and replanted what little seed they had left. The thaw was slow, but it brought with it a promise, a whisper from the past, reminding them that even the smallest acts of kindness could echo across generations. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, the town gathered around the great fire once more. The light flickered across their faces, warm against the fading cold. Clara held the letter in her lap, her eyes reflecting the flames. "He thought we'd be forgotten," she said softly. "But we weren't. We're still here, still standing." Elias placed an arm around her shoulders, his voice low and sure. "That's what survival means. It's not just living, it's being remembered." The others nodded, their faces solemn, the firelight catching on the tears that glistened in their eyes. When the fire burned low and the stars emerged in the dark sky, Clara rose and stepped outside. The night was cold, but gentle now, the wind carrying the faint scent of thawing earth. She looked toward the hill where Samuel's grave lay, and the aspen tree they had planted, the tree of mercy. Its branches were dusted with frost, its leaves long gone, but it still stood tall, shimmering faintly in the moonlight. She smiled and whispered, "We made it again." Her voice drifted through the air, carried by the same wind that had haunted this valley for generations. But now, instead of sorrow, it carried peace, and somewhere in the distance, where the mountains met the sky, the first call of spring answered her soft, hopeful, eternal. The days grew longer, and the air began to soften. The valley that had once been buried in silence was alive again with the gentle rhythm of life returning. The river sang its song freely now, winding through the thawed earth like a ribbon of glass. The snow that had blanketed Ember's rest for so many months had vanished, leaving behind a land both scarred and beautiful, a place reborn from hardship. The people, too, had changed. They carried new lines on their faces, quiet memories in their eyes, and a deep, unspoken pride in their hearts. They had survived one of the cruelest winters the West had ever known, not through strength alone, but through kindness, through unity, and through the simple will to live another day. Clara stood on the ridge, overlooking the town as dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and amber. The sunlight touched the rooftops, the church steeple, the half-mended fences, and finally the aspen tree, the tree of mercy that had grown taller since the thaw. Its branches swayed gently, whispering in the morning wind. Below her, the town stirred to life. Smoke curled from chimneys, roosters called, and the faint clatter of tools echoed from the blacksmith's forge. Ember's Rest was breathing again. Yet, in Clara's heart, she knew the time had come to make a choice that had been building since the letter was found. That letter had awakened something in her. It wasn't just a message from the past. It was a reminder that survival alone was not enough. The valley had been a refuge, yes, but it was also a prison of memory, a place that trapped those too afraid to move on. Clara had lost much here, but she had also found strength, and now that strength called her beyond the mountains. She wanted to see what lay beyond the horizon, the towns, the railways, the places where the world still grew. Yet the thought of leaving Ember's Rest felt like tearing a piece of her soul from her body. Elias found her by the ridge, his coat slung over his shoulder, his expression knowing. "You're thinking about leaving," he said quietly. Clara didn't answer at first. She kept her eyes on the rising sun. "I'm thinking about living," she finally whispered. "About starting somewhere new." Elias nodded slowly, his gaze following hers. "You've earned that, Clara. We all have. But someone needs to stay too, to remember." She turned to him, her eyes glistening. "And you'll stay?" He smiled faintly. "This land's been stubborn with me. I think it's not done teaching me yet." The town held a meeting that night in the old hall, lit by lanterns and warmed by the fire that had once been their lifeline. The room was full faces, young and old, scarred and smiling. Clara stood before them, holding the letter that had bound them all to their past. "We've done more than survive," she said softly. "We've lived through something that will be remembered. But the world out there, it's changing. New towns are rising, new roads being built. Ember's Rest can stay, but some of us must go carry the story forward, build new homes, plant new trees. The kindness that saved us shouldn't die here. It should travel." A murmur rippled through the crowd, fear, sadness, but also understanding. Father Alcott rose slowly, his hands folded before him. "The Lord does not chain us to the soil," he said gently. "He gives us roots to endure and wings to seek. Go, and let the valley be proud of what it gave you." The room fell silent. Then, one by one, people began to nod. Some would stay to tend the farms and rebuild. Others, like Clara, would leave to find new beginnings. But they all knew they were bound by something that distance could not break. When dawn came, a small group gathered at the edge of town. Their wagons were loaded lightly, food, blankets, tools, a few keepsakes. Clara stood among them, Jonah at her side, his small hand gripping hers. Elias clasped her shoulder. "If you ever find yourself missing the cold," he said with a crooked smile, "look for the first snow wherever you are. It'll remind you of home." Clara smiled through her tears. "And if you ever see the first blossom," she said, "remember us." They embraced once, firm and wordless, before she climbed into the wagon. As the wheels began to turn, the people left behind raised their hands in farewell. The wagons rolled through the thawing fields, the mud splashing beneath the horses' hooves. The wind carried the sound of their departure through the valley, a soft creak of wood, a rhythmic clatter, a quiet melody of change. Clara looked back one last time. Ember's Rest stood small against the mountains, smoke rising gently from its chimneys. the aspen tree shimmered in the distance, its branches catching the light like threads of silver. She took a deep breath and whispered, "Thank you." They traveled for days through the wilderness, following trails that twisted through pine forests and rocky ridges. At night, they made camp beneath the stars. The air was still cold, but no longer cruel. Around the fire, they told stories of the winter that almost broke them, of the letter that had saved them, of the people who stayed behind. Jonah often fell asleep mid-story, his head resting against Clara's arm. She would watch the flames flicker, thinking of all they had left behind and all that still lay ahead. One evening, after crossing a long stretch of open plain, they came upon a ridge that overlooked a vast valley of land, untouched, blanketed in grass that swayed like an ocean. A river wound through it, glinting under the twilight. Clara stood at the edge, her heart swelling. "We could build here," she said softly, "a place of our own." The others nodded, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in gold and violet, she felt a warmth she hadn't known in years, a sense of peace, of purpose. Weeks later, when the first wooden frame of their new settlement stood upright, Clara planted an aspen sapling beside it. The soil was dark, rich, welcoming. Jonah helped her pat it down, his small hands pressing the earth gently. "Do you think it'll grow?" he asked. Clara smiled, brushing a lock of hair from his face. "It will. Aspens always find a way." She looked toward the horizon, where faint clouds hinted at the next season's change. "And so will we." As night fell, the new town's mall, nameless yet, glowed with the light of their campfires. The stars shone bright above the wind, carrying whispers from the mountains far behind. In the distance, Ember's Rest slept beneath the same sky, its lanterns flickering like tiny embers in the dark. Two places, two hearts, bound by the same story, the same fire that refused to die. And in that quiet, as the flames crackled and the wind sighed through the young aspen leaves, Clara closed her eyes and smiled. The winter was gone. The world was wide again. And somewhere between the cold she had survived and the warmth she had found, she understood what it truly meant to live. For in every life touched by kindness, in every heart that refused to give up, there burned the last gentle light of Ember's Rest, a light that would never fade.